Welcome to Eye for Iran. Iran International has learned that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and the armed forces are negotiating to receive Chinese missiles, drones, and air defense systems as payment for oil. Now, one Beijing-based company owes Tehran nearly $1 billion for oil shipments linked to IRGC-affiliated firms. A new Wall Street Journal investigation also reveals that China secretly funneled up to $8.4 billion to Iran last year through a covert payment network. That's a system that essentially swaps oil for infrastructure projects, bypassing U.S. sanctions entirely. Despite renewed UN sanctions, Iran is still exporting between 1.3 and 1.5 million barrels of oil a day, about 90% of it to China, often through ship-to-ship transfers that conceal the cargo's origin. Eurasia Group's Iran analyst, Greg Brew, calls this the age of oil sanctions as a coercive tool is coming to an end. Brew is also a historian and the author of 2 books on oil, Iran, and U.S. foreign policy. The Oil Kings, How U.S. Policy and Iranian Oil Shaped the Modern Middle East, and Petroleum and Progress in Iran. We'll unpack how Iran's oil exports, shadow networks, and deals with China are reshaping its economy and testing the limits of U.S. sanctions.
From then, it's moved to usually it's moved to Malaysia or Indonesia, where it's then very often transferred to a third tanker that can move it to a port in the Shandong province in China.
I'm Negar Mojtahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Greg Brew joins us now on Eye for Iran. Thank you for being here and welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me back.
It's a pleasure. So, Greg, you're an expert on Iran, and you focus on the geopolitics of oil and gas. You've written that the age of oil sanctions as a coercive tool is coming to an end in a foreign policy article recently in July. Now, when we look at Iran still exporting well over 1 million barrels of oil a day under Trump's renewed maximum pressure, what does that tell us?
Well, first of all, we need to think of the realm of the oil market in 2 ways. First, there's the conventional oil market, right? Huge amounts of oil flowing from places like the United States, Saudi Arabia, other states in the Middle East and Latin America that are going to customers all over the world, right? This is the conventional oil market. The oil is priced largely in dollars. It's moved by tankers and pipelines, all very conventional, all very normal. Next to that, we have the sanctioned oil market, which I noted in my article. It includes oil produced by Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. And this market has grown enormously in the last 5 or 6 years. It encompasses over 10% of global oil production. And these 3 countries, Iran, Russia, and Venezuela combined, they hold over 1/3 of the world's proven oil reserves. So this is a large amount of oil. That's massive. Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. And the way this oil moves, it's become very complex. It largely moves to customers in China. China is the world's largest oil importing country. It depends on oil imports. China's also formed foreign policy, geopolitical relationships with these 3 countries. There are a variety of actors involved, from refiners to import terminals to shipping companies to financial entities that are all involved in moving this sanctioned crude and also moving the money that's being used to pay for it. And while there's always been a certain amount of illicit oil that's moved around the world, the reason why this market has grown so hugely is because of the United States. Since 2018, when the U.S. exited the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions on Iran, there have been continuous waves of sanctions from the United States, not only on Iran, but also on Russia in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. There have been new sanctions and restrictions placed on Venezuela, which has been a sort of a focus of U.S. foreign policy for a long time, but which is also a major oil producer. And so as the U.S. sanctions regime has gotten bigger, the amount of sanctioned oil has gotten larger. These producers haven't stopped producing or exporting. They've taken hits. Iran and Venezuela don't export as much as they used to. But as you mentioned, Iran currently exports over 1.5 million barrels a day, almost all of it going to China. So we live in this new geopolitical system where there's the conventional oil market and there's the sanctioned oil market. And despite the United States rolling out new sanctions, just today there was a new round of U.S. sanctions on Iran. Over 50 entities, individuals, tankers, companies as well as entities in China, were sanctioned by the United States. It hasn't stopped the flow. It hasn't ended this sanctioned oil market. And in fact, as the sanctions grow and as these actors become more adept at avoiding them or growing used to them as they do business, it's only solidified the existence of this new market and the bifurcation of the global oil market in general.
So from what I gather, from what you're saying, is it safe to say that in some ways the U.S. sanctions has created an economy of oil sanctions that it can't actually now control?
Yes, in a way, given how the sanctions have been grown, have expanded over a number of years, and given how the United States is now committed to maintaining these sanctions, right? I mean, it's quite easy for the U.S. to sanction new actors that are involved in the Iran, Russia, or Venezuelan oil trade, but it's actually quite difficult from a political standpoint to then roll the sanctions back. Right? The United States has resisted, offering sanctions relief to, say, Iran, unless Iran is willing to make major concessions on its nuclear program, on its support for regional proxies, on its development of ballistic missiles, even as the sanctions have put enormous pressure on Iran's economy. As I've argued in my article, it hasn't really moved the needle for Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and for other Iranian leaders. If anything, they have become more resistant, more defiant of U.S. pressure as the sanctions have built over time. So sanctions have had an impact, there's no question, but the idea that they can be used to change state behavior, that they can be used to coerce actors like Iran into making adjustments in their foreign policy, I think that age is coming to an end.
And that was the kind of original intent of sanctions. For those of us who studied political science and international relations, that's what the whole purpose of it was. So has the intent possibly changed if it's not working in the way that it was originally planned to have?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, as you note, the whole idea of sanctions is not implementing them, it's lifting them. Once you've seen the result that you're looking for, once the target has, reacted to the pressure, changed its behavior, accepted that in order for sanctions relief to come, it has to make certain concessions. That's what you really want to see. You don't want the sanctions to remain in place forever. But perpetual sanctions is kind of what we're looking at when it comes to economic relations for countries like Iran and Venezuela. Maybe not Russia. The U.S. does seem to have a slightly more flexible relationship with Russia, at least under this administration. But certainly when it comes to Iran, I think in the wake of the war in June, in the wake of the return of UN snapback sanctions last month, I think there is now a general acknowledgement that any hope of sanctions relief that Iran may have had has dwindled to almost nothing. But that does get at your question, your point, which is that if the sanctions are never going to go away, what purpose are they meant to serve? And that was another idea that I was trying to flesh out in my article. The sanctions, as I've mentioned, they have changed the global oil market. Iran is still producing and exporting oil, but it can only sell it to one customer, China.
But that one customer is huge. They've got a big
Exactly.
footprint, right?
Absolutely. But countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, even countries in Europe that used to buy Iranian oil, if the sanctions went away, would probably go back to buying Iranian oil. It's commercially viable, it's fairly inexpensive, it's available, but the sanctions have forced Iran into a single commercial channel from which it is unlikely to be able to break out. The fact that China is so big, the fact that it is a peer competitor to the United States, that it has an independent foreign policy, that it resists U.S. sanctions pressure. As some recent reporting from the Wall Street Journal indicates, China has now worked out some very creative solutions of how to reduce the risk of sanctions in its oil trade with Iran. So this has facilitated the expansion of this trade. But China's not going anywhere. China isn't suddenly going to become more vulnerable to U.S. economic pressure. It may take less Iranian crude as its own needs for oil imports fall over the next 5 to 10 years. But the idea that this sanctioned oil market is going to vanish is simply not credible. I think it's going to be with us for a long time.
Well, and also you mentioned the scale, right? If 1/3 of oil production is coming from sanctioned countries, that's huge on its own. So it makes it a lot more difficult.
1/3 of global reserves. It's about 10%, 10 or 11% of production, right? If you add
that you
up
can
Russia,
actually use,
Iran, exactly. I mean, it's a tremendous volume, which it gets to the point. It gets to the idea that this sanctioned market isn't going to go away. These aren't small producers with small reserves. These are some of the world's largest oil reserve holders in the world, between Russia and Iran and Venezuela. So it's a lot of oil that could conceivably be sold over a long period of time. But balanced against the size of the conventional oil market, it's small, it's 10%, but it's big enough that it has an oversized influence. It casts a pretty large shadow over the rest of the oil market. And this gets to another element, the volatility that comes from this illicit channel, right? Oil market analysts, oil market watchers are always conscious of, is this week the week that Iran finally gets cut off from China? In which case you're losing 1.5 million barrels a day.
Could it?
It might. I mean, I'm skeptical of that, but it's possible that China, on a whim, or the Chinese actors that are involved in this crude market decide to look elsewhere. There's also a long-running concern that there could be major disruption in Russian oil exports, given the amount of pressure on Russia, not only from sanctions, but also from Ukrainian attacks on Russian refineries. There's this concern that, you could lose Russian exports. That increases the volatility. That increases the uncertainty. So you have the sanctioned oil market that's kind of, it's bleeding into the conventional oil market. It's creating more concern and putting some amount of upward pressure on oil prices worldwide.
And you mentioned the Wall Street Journal report, bombshell report, that says China is basically funneling about $8.4 billion to Iran through kind of this barter-like trade system. So it's not cash. So what does that mean in reality in terms of Iran and their ability, from the perspective of the U.S., for example, to be able to carry out their proxy networks, et cetera, their pursuit potentially of the nuclear bomb? What does that mean when it's not cash?
Well, the fact that it's not cash, I think, is very important. And it helps resolve something of a mystery over the last several years, which is how China was paying for all this oil, right? There have been leaked documents that suggest that Iran is being paid in hard currency. There is a certain amount of money that gets back to Iran or that ends up in the hands of intermediaries, the sort of shadowy actors that help facilitate the movement. But for the most part, it was very unclear if Iran was actually earning dollars, euros, any other hard currency from China, because it wasn't.
So they could have potentially?
Perhaps, but it wasn't really showing up in economic data, right? It wasn't really, if Iran was earning, it was exporting crude oil that was worth $30 billion, but there wasn't $30 billion coming back into the Iranian economy. So where was the money going? The journal article helped clarify that the Chinese probably aren't paying Iran in money. They're paying them in other ways. They're paying them in barter agreements. They're paying them in trade. They're using the earnings, but they're keeping them in China to fund trade going back to Iran. There's also been an indication that the Chinese are paying them in contracts, perhaps for development projects, perhaps for investment in Iran's domestic economy, but also perhaps just in spare parts, infrastructure, technical support for Iran's existing industry. It suggests that the Chinese are doing a little bit to help keep Iran afloat. And this has gotten to a bigger question, which is, the nature of the Iran-China relationship. Iran is constantly looking for more help from Beijing, and it hasn't been getting it, right? It suggests that China is doing what it can to keep Iran from collapsing, but doesn't seem interested in expanding the relationship in any significant way.
And also, China's obviously getting this oil at like a discounted rate. So this is very beneficial to them. In some ways, it's the U.S., perhaps with their sanctions. Does this help make China stronger?
In a way, yes. I mean, the sanctions, when you sanction crude producers like Iran and Russia, you don't necessarily stop them from producing or exporting the oil, but you do put them at a competitive disadvantage, because now there's a risk that customers are taking when they buy that crude that puts customers in a position where they can bargain for a better deal. So Iran, Russia do have to put a discount on their crude. It changes according to fluctuations in the commercial environment. But it does mean that the Chinese now have this kind of captive source of supply. They can get Iranian crude for a lot less than they could get crude from alternative sources. And they also know that the Iranians can't sell to anyone else. So in a way, the sanctions are helping China, or at least refiners and actors in China who need this crude for their operations. But again, as far as what it does with the Iran-China relationship, the Chinese might be playing their hand very well here. They might be using the payment, however we want to think of it, back to Iran in order to help Iran sustain its oil industry. Another mystery over the last few years is how Iran has been able to keep its production fairly resilient, given the impact of sanctions, given the fact that they can't get foreign investment from really anywhere. It's possible that the Chinese are paying Iran through support for their oil industry so that they can keep this flow going. So the Chinese are essentially serving their own interests rather than helping Iran in broader ways.
Yeah, this reminds me of at Vancouver Provincial Court here, back when I was a local reporter in British Columbia. Every day I would be at the trial for, I don't know if you remember Huawei, and the Huawei executive who was in Vancouver, and there was an extradition process for her back to the U.S. because they were, again, bypassing U.S. sanctions to provide, I think it was U.S. dollars actually in that case, to Iran.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think what we've learned over the last year or so is that China, it doesn't want Iran to crumble. It doesn't want the regime to come under tremendous pressure. So it's willing to give them a certain amount of lifeline, but really only on terms that are beneficial to Chinese interests. And the Chinese interest, one of the major Chinese interests, is maintaining secure access to energy sources. China is dependent on importing energy. It's long been a particular strategic concern that they've had, the fact that they need to import so much oil, so much gas. It's why they're embracing the energy transition so aggressively, right? Every day we see new headlines of the amount of wind power, the amount of solar power that China is installing. China is pursuing nuclear power. Part of that comes from their insecurity when it comes to energy imports. So the fact that they can get energy from Iran fairly cheaply, that it helps keep Iran at least somewhat afloat, but that it doesn't require a greater degree of effort on the part of Beijing. I should note that the customers in China that take this crude, they're so-called teapot independent refiners. They are not owned by major Chinese state energy companies. They tend to be fairly small. A lot of them are under quite a bit of pressure internally as China is changing the nature of its refining complex. So they are somewhat marginal actors in the broader realm of China's energy industry, which means it's even better for Beijing because they don't really need to care. They don't really need to watch the trade very much. They can essentially, they can look the other way, in other words. Another aspect of it is that China doesn't declare Iran's oil in its customs data. It always shows up as Malaysian crude or UAE crude. And whenever China comes under question of it, they say, we don't think U.S. sanctions on Iran are legal, but we don't do any business in Iranian oil, so it doesn't matter to us.
Technically, so right? Yeah,
technically. So the way the trade is set up gives them a degree of deniability, and it helps, again, keep the relationship with Iran on a stable but fairly limited basis.
Yeah, it's an interesting relationship because this is kind of a funny side story, but when I was at the United Nations General Assembly covering that back in September, I had a reporter from China come up to me and he was like, "Oh, what network are you?" And I was just like, "Oh, Iran International." He's like, "Oh, Iran, China, we're really good friends." And then he took a picture with me, probably thinking I'm like state TV or something, which is actually pretty funny. I didn't say anything. He was so happy, so I didn't want to.
I mean, it's, public diplomacy. China's very often putting out statements supporting Iran's positions on things. Pezeshkian was in China for the big, anniversary, the SCO meeting, taking photos with Chinese officials. But when it comes to sort of material benefit, particularly in the aftermath of the war in June, Iran hasn't gotten much. Iran's isolation has become even more profound, I would say, in the aftermath of both the war and the snapback sanctions. And while China is somewhat supportive, it's not ready to rush to Iran's assistance.
And earlier, you brought up a really significant point, and you talked about kind of the middlemen in this whole process, kind of the shadow networks. And this brings me to a broader point of who are the winners and losers here, and what is the real impact for what is, and I use this quote unquote working, because it depends how you define what is working in the first place. And I wanted to bring up a very important character that doesn't often get a lot of attention, but he should. Babak Zanjani. So he's kind of like an oligarch for those who don't know. Prosecutors in Iran have claimed that he withheld $2.7 billion that belonged to Iran's Ministry of Petroleum for his role of kind of being this intermediary between Iran's oil trade under sanctions. So talk about that, and again, the winners and the losers here.
Well, the Zanjani case is very interesting because people may not know that there is quite a lot of internal debate and discussion and argument over issues of corruption inside Iran between the various agencies, the various power centers and factions. And it's one way in which the sanctions have had an impact on Iran internally. First of all, they've been very damaging to Iran's broader economy. There's no question. Purchasing power is way down. The currency has become significantly reduced in value. Economic growth has been impacted. Iran is likely, the size of Iran's economy is likely to shrink this year and next year in terms of real GDP. Inflation has obviously been a massive problem. The lack of foreign investment, a lot of this is downstream of sanctions. The fact that the sanctions are not going anywhere, are likely to remain in place, if not permanently, then for a very, very long time. At the same time, sanctions have produced some clear winners, and they're members of this, as you mentioned, sort of oligarchic elite class. Many of them have ties to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has a very, very large imprint on Iran's broader economy, including the energy industry. And the fact that the sanctions exist, as I mentioned, it doesn't shut the trade down. It moves the trade into the shadows. And wherever you have a black market, you have individuals who stand to profit. These individuals are in Iran. They're also in places in the Gulf, in China, in Singapore, in Hong Kong. This whole network of intermediaries that benefit from the movement of this sanctioned crude, they tend to be self-interested. They tend to exist in this sort of separate band. And the fact that the sanctions have benefited them gives them an incentive in keeping the sanctions in place. And you've seen some of that play out in the internal politics of Iran. There's an entire class of hardliners. Many of them have ties to the Guards who argue that continued resistance to sanctions is preferable to making any kind of concession.
So they can make money.
Because they're making money, right? Because they personally benefit. And it's a broad problem. It's a complex problem. It's a major obstacle to reaching any kind of diplomatic solution, which right now looks very remote, but which is even more remote since you have this class of profiteers. But it does suggest the direction of travel. If the Islamic Republic remains in power, if the elite are able to hold on against sources of internal and external pressure, then those who emerge as the more powerful are likely to be the ones who are benefiting from this sanctioned network. And of course, the benefits are not being accrued by the Iranian people. The Iranian people are punished and pressured and squeezed, even as this relatively small corrupt elite profit from it personally.
Yeah, the people of Iran are being pushed from all different sides, right? For viewers who and myself who want like a visual picture of the shadow network, can you describe it to me? Like, how does the oil physically leave Iran? We know there's these shadow networks, but we don't really know how the process works, like tankers, ship-to-ship transfers, reflagging, etc. And what financial channels or intermediaries then turn that crude payment into benefits with banks and insurers? Because I assume then you could put sanctions on those too. So how does it work? Like, does it go to Malaysia first? Like, I really would love to know.
Well, on the physical side, it's a little bit easier to track because we can see the crude moving, right? Physical traders, tanker trackers, companies like Kepler, Vortexa, tanker trackers, like they have the equipment, the technology to actually watch the crude moving. And that's one of the major reasons why we can gauge the volume of Iranian crude moving from Iran to China. But to give you a physical breakdown, the tankers leave Iran's export terminals, the largest one being Klarg Island, which is just off the coast of Khuzestan in southwestern Iran. The crude is usually then transferred from one tanker into another tanker somewhere in the Persian Gulf or Gulf of Oman, in the general vicinity of Iran. The reason for that is most of Iran's tankers, the ones that are owned by Iran's entities or Iran's companies, are under sanction. So they can't move the crude to any port without that port turning them away. So the oil needs to be moved onto another tanker. From then it's moved to, usually it's moved to Malaysia or Indonesia, where it's then very often transferred to a third tanker.
Wow.
that can move it to a port in the Shandong province in China. So you've had multiple ship-to-ship transfers. Sometimes there are long delays, occasionally lasting weeks, where the tankers will sit and wait for a transfer. And you have the oil showing up in what's known as floating storage, where the tankers have been sitting without a buyer for their crude, but oil if it's stored properly, if it's been moved properly, can sit on the tanker for a very, very long time without without its viscosity or its quality being affected in any serious way. So the ship-to-ship transfers help. Very often these tankers turn off their AIS transponders, which make them more difficult to track. They assume false identities. They put out bogus AIS coordinates, saying that they're hundreds of miles away from their actual physical location to throw off the scent of any monitors. They'll change their names. They'll change their listings. If a tanker is sanctioned, it will be sold by its operator owner to another company. It'll be given a new name, and it'll show up in the registry as something different. So there's lots of nifty things to do on the physical side to obscure the trade. On the financial side, it's even more obscure. So the contracts will go through multiple hands before they end up with their final customers in China. They'll be moved from a company based very often in either Iran or the UAE to a company that's then based in Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, or mainland China. The contract will, based on existing documents that we've seen, sometime the contract will be held in stasis along with the tanker if it's being held in floating storage. So it can take weeks for this trade to actually reach its conclusion. But tracking it on the intermediary side is often extremely difficult to do. We don't have a great deal of understanding as to whether money is really changing hands, whether these are barter agreements. Sometimes cryptocurrency is used, which makes it even more difficult to track. So both on the physical side and on the transactional side, the layers of obscurity, the layers of complexity can make it quite difficult. Now, OFAC, the office within the US Department of Treasury that is charged with drafting sanctions, OFAC has a very, very nuanced understanding of these networks. We've seen it in multiple sanctions announcements, right? The officers in OFAC know what they're doing. They have the resources that they need to track down these networks. The problem is resources. OFAC can only develop new sanctions at a certain speed and with a certain degree of depth and breadth. And
by then they can just change the name, right? And just do
exactly.
it all over again.
By the time the sanctions, exactly. By the time the sanctions have been drafted, reviewed, announced, and implemented, those who are involved in the trade will shut down operations and move somewhere else. And given the size of the trade, there are others who are unaffected by one sanctions round. You have to get to them in the next 2 or 3 or 4 sanctions rounds. So again, given the size of the trade, given the relative fungibility of the oil being moved around, each new sanctions round, it might make a dent in the flow, but it won't cut off the flow entirely.
Wow, that's fascinating. And it's a lot of effort. It's very organized, right, from what you've described. And it's also, like you talked about earlier, means that you only have so much control over it too, right? It's just something that's out of reach in so many ways. And now that you've described the kind of the shadow fleets and the underground network, can you talk just briefly about sanctions itself, like primary versus secondary sanctions, and how the U.S. can enforce it?
Sure. So, as you say, there are 2 main forms of sanctions. The primary sanctions are placed directly on entities involved in these trades, and the authority to implement sanctions, it comes from specific executive orders or specific acts of Congress. So there has to be some kind of legal basis. Fortunately, the legal basis for sanctions on Iran is pretty broad, pretty well established, given Iran's support for terrorist organizations, given Iran's defiance of the UN and other international organizations on its nuclear program, given the fact that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is listed as a terrorist organization by the United States and is involved in many aspects of this trade, it's quite easy for the US to roll out new sanctions on these specific entities. The primary sanctions work in a pretty straightforward way. They freeze any assets that these entities might have within the U.S. jurisdiction. It prohibits doing any business with the entities, again, within the U.S. jurisdiction. They also come with the threat of secondary sanctions. And secondary sanctions extend to any entities that are then doing business with the sanctioned entity. And the secondary sanctions are really where the power of sanctions come from. And it's the reason why when the U.S. when the U.S. exited the nuclear deal in 2018 and rolled sanctions back on Iran, that was where the initial economic impact became greatest, was because you had commercial entities in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, elsewhere, they stopped their business with Iran because they didn't want to come under sanctions. They didn't want to be affected by secondary sanctions that the U.S. was going to roll out on them. So the power of sanctions, because sanctions do have power, there's no doubt about it, it comes not only from the U.S. ability to directly sanction companies and individuals, but also to extend the threat of sanction to anyone who does business with those individuals, entities, or companies.
And I guess there comes kind of the brilliance of China is that it's not the Chinese government per se involved in this. So they have that plausible deniability. So the secondary sanctions are not going to be as effective, I guess, in this particular case.
Exactly. And given the size of the Chinese market, given how large, the Chinese refinery base, import terminal, given how big this industry is, you have, pretty significant customers of Iranian crude who don't care if they get sanctioned. I mean, I've been told this directly by, various people who are familiar with this trade. If there are Chinese businessmen who learn that they've been sanctioned by OFAC, they say, okay, that's something. Well, what's how many more barrels do we need from Tehran next month? All right, we need this many barrels. Like, they don't care because they don't do business in dollars. They don't conduct business with Western banks. They exist within the Chinese economic ecosystem. And given the state of, it's fairly controlled at the moment, but given the state of confrontation between the US and China, they don't feel any big pressure from Beijing to cut off this trade. If you saw a significant rapprochement between the US and China on a variety of issues, if that became possible, then it is possible that to assuage the US, to improve the state of US-China relations, Beijing could suddenly say, all right, we're turning off the tap. Iran doesn't get any more money, or however we're paying them. We're not going to take Iran oil anymore. I'm skeptical that they'll ever do that because of the way they've constructed and organized this trade. They have deniability. They've managed it in a very specific way. It serves their commercial and security interests. It helps keep the Iranians afloat, but only just, so they're not, tremendously exposed on that file. So even if there was some interest in Beijing to offer this up to the United States, to the Americans as part of a broader deal, I don't see why they would do it.
And given this, oil flow going to China, despite the U.S. sanctions and everything you just explained here, do you think these economic realities influence Iran's kind of long-term decision-making towards engagement, like what we saw during the JCPOA years, and isolation, which is what we're seeing now?
Well, imagining how it affects Iran's long-term strategy would assume that Iran has a long-term strategy at the moment, which I don't know if it does.
I don't think it does either.
Everything I've heard and seen suggests that the regime from Khamenei on down are stuck. There's been relatively little change in really any policy file. They're still supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon. They've offered support to the Trump peace plan in Gaza, which was just announced yesterday, which was somewhat surprising. But given how little Hamas matters to them strategically, it's not a huge lift for them.
Yeah, Trump even said the Iranians are working with him.
Exactly.
Like,
it's very
okay.
Given the amount, given the variety of Trump commentary on Iran over the last 9 months, and then given what's actually happened. Anytime I see anytime I see Trump talk about Iran, I have to remember to ground it in some basis of reality. And the reality is, the U.S. They want to see Iran give up enrichment. They want to see Iran hand over its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. They want to see Iran end its nuclear program. And Iran won't do that, even with the war, even with the damage that's been done, even with snapback sanctions. Khamenei said very clearly several weeks ago that we are not going to retreat from enrichment. That we're not going to, that talking directly to the United States is a waste of time. At the same time, the U.S. is also looking for concessions from Iran on things like ballistic missiles and regional proxies, which, as I mentioned, they're not backing away from any of those things. I think right now Iran is trying to get through the next 6 months to a year. I think the leadership is interested, above all else, in holding on to power, rebuilding some degree of deterrence, some degree of military capability against Israel, given how the war in June went. But as far as a long-term strategy to get out from under the pressure of sanctions, President Pezeshkian made sanctions relief a key part of his presidential campaign last year, and hope for sanctions relief has now completely gone out the window because there isn't going to be a deal with the United States.
Yeah, I heard some people saying he might even resign. That there's some talk that he might do that because he promised that he would bring about sanctions relief.
I mean, he's under tremendous pressure. I think the way in which Khamenei has sort of connected himself to Pezeshkian and vice versa, I think it makes something like that fairly unlikely. The regime is trying to hold on and maintain unity and survive. And I think they're trying to figure out what to do next. And they haven't gotten to that point yet. They probably will at some point, but they have to get through these initial crises first. As far as how to address the sanctions, I think we're just going to see more of what we've seen. Talk of this so-called resistance economy, Sanctions are putting enormous pressure on Iran, but they're not causing the economy to collapse, given how long the sanctions have now been in place. There's been a degree of adaptation to them. Iran is still able to do business with states like Iraq, the UAE, Turkey, China, obviously, and Russia. And given the support that it's getting in those quarters, then it will probably hold on. But any hope of a positive boost, any hope of relief or an improvement in the economic situation that might come from sanctions relief, I think has receded very far into the background.
So what story do the numbers tell you? Like if you look at oil production during the kind of engagement years when there was, I'm not going to say no sanctions at all, but less sanctions, what was the production like versus now? Is the trajectory upwards, downwards? Is it hard to just track because a lot of it is in the shadow network? What are the numbers? What story do the numbers tell you rather?
Well, on production, it's actually a little easier to see how the state of Iran's oil industry is doing. You know, Iran's national oil company does publish statistics. The Statistical Center of Iran does publish statistics. The World Bank, the IMF continue to monitor Iran's economy, and they put out reports that are pretty reliable. Iran's Chamber of Commerce is also quite a good source on this. And the story there is, yes, you know, when sanctions were lifted between 2015 and 2018, Iran was able to produce and export more oil. Overall production neared 4 million barrels a day. Exports exceeded 2 million barrels a day. When sanctions were reimposed in 2018, from sort of 2018 to 2020, you had a very significant downturn in Iran's oil production and oil exports. At one point in 2020, Iran's exports fell to below 300,000 barrels a day, which was incredibly low. Now, sanctions were a reason for that. The other reason for that was the global economy shut down for about 8 months in 2020. So there wasn't any demand for Iranian crude.
Pandemic.
Yeah, exactly, because of the pandemic. What you've seen now is a surprising degree of resilience. Iran's exports, they oscillate quite significantly month to month because of the delays and disruptions that I mentioned. You know, you very often have tankers that sit and wait to deliver oil. Chinese demand tends to oscillate as well. Sometimes it'll be a little higher, sometimes it'll be a little lower. But just in the last 3 months, Iran has exceeded 1.7 million barrels a day, month to month. So it's moving, it's exporting a lot of crude. And its energy industry, its energy minister, has been announcing new investments in production, expansion of existing fields. There's confidence that Iran's oil production will continue to grow along with exports, which is somewhat surprising. So as far as the size and the shape of the industry, it's holding up surprisingly well, which leads me to think, or at least me to speculate, that it is getting a degree of help from China, that China is paying for its oil by reinvesting in Iran's own oil industry to keep this flow going, to keep Iran's oil production fairly high. It's what I would do if I were China, and it might be how they're doing it. The final element I'll say is, given how important oil exports are to both the Iranian economy, but also the state of Iran's finances, they are earning money from it, and they're able to save money by getting these barter deals with China. It's a priority for the regime to make sure that oil is getting the attention that it needs. And this is another reason why sanctions haven't really worked to change state behavior, is if you're shrinking the overall size of the pie, if you're shrinking your target's economy, you are making it that much more important to retain oil as a source of earnings,
Exactly.
as a source of hard currency. So you're increasing incentive to boost oil production. So you're not actually accomplishing what you're setting out to do. So my expectation would be, Iran is going to continue to come under pressure. The overall amount of oil it's able to produce has been slowly declining since 2018 and is likely to continue to slowly decline. If Chinese oil demand slows or falls, which is likely, again, given the pace of the energy transition in China, then the size of Iran's market is going to shrink. And its ability to export oil is going to shrink because it can only export to one source. So near term, Iran's oil prospects are okay. I'd say medium to long term, they don't look great.
And speaking of China, here at Iran International, my colleague Shahed Alavi has an exclusive. He's reporting that Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and the Armed Forces General Staff have discussed receiving Chinese weapons as payment for oil. So from your vantage point, what does that tell you in terms of how sanctions are shaping Iran's military economy specifically?
Well, we know from OFAC listings and announcements that the industry, the military infrastructure of Iran, the armed forces, the Ministry of Defense and Logistics, Modafil, the IRGC, All of them are involved in the oil trade because of the importance of the oil trade to the regime's finances, its ability to support regional proxies, etc. If Iran is looking to trade oil for weapons with China, it wouldn't surprise me. It would surprise me if China took them up on that offer. The Chinese have been selling weapon systems over the last 10 years. The arms trade for China has become somewhat more important. I do think they're wary of extending that kind of direct support to Iran. That does not mean that Chinese weapon systems don't end up in Iran through other intermediaries. It's possible that North Korea could supply Iran with weapons. The North Koreans like to be paid in cash, and they don't really care who they do business with. So given the degree of desperation that the Iranians have, I wouldn't entirely discount that possibility, even though the Iranians don't trust the North Koreans and never have. They may be able to acquire weapon systems from China if their position becomes even weaker. So if we do see renewed rounds of fighting between Iran and Israel,
so desperation takes in.
Exactly. I think it's quite likely that Israel strikes Iran again.
Oh, for sure. Now Netanyahu is saying that Iran is trying to build up missiles all the way to San Francisco or something. So, I mean, definitely he's...
I mean, the confrontation hasn't ended. The war hasn't really ended. It's paused for the moment. The fact that Iran remains weak is only further incentive to Israel to use military action in the absence of any kind of diplomacy to address things like the highly enriched uranium and the missiles and what have you. So, additional military confrontation is likely. If Iran's position continues to weaken, their desperation will grow. And the Chinese concern that Iran is on the brink of some kind of calamity may increase, and that may facilitate greater amounts of military assistance. But I think the Chinese are going to be quite unwilling to go that far. It's been surprising that the Russians have not extended much military assistance to Iran. The fact that Russia is so reticent to do so suggests to me that the Chinese are even more so. But that doesn't mean the Iranians aren't going to try, given how vulnerable they are and given how greatly they need military assistance.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good point. So if, as you argue, sanctions don't have the effect, the kind of coercion effect that it originally intended to have, what other kind of alternative tools are in place that could work?
Well, if you're the United States, if you're the Trump administration and you're looking at the current situation where, Iran's nuclear program has been heavily damaged, but it hasn't been destroyed, and it probably can't be destroyed by purely military means. It would take a much larger operation, and it would take, I think, doing something that would have a greater risk of regional escalation. And it's also just difficult to do, given that Iran has built its nuclear industry indigenously. So only using military force is tough to do. At the same time, as we've seen, the sanctions aren't changing the regime's behavior. That being said, if I'm President Trump and I'm looking at the situation, it looks pretty good from the vantage point of the United States. Iran has been pushed away from a nuclear weapon. They're much further away than they were. They can attempt to rebuild, but now there's a very credible threat of Israeli military action if they try. There are now UN sanctions in place that bring a degree of international credibility to the US and Israeli efforts to keep Iran from building a weapon. Iran, as we've seen, doesn't have many friends. They're not getting much help from the Russians and the Chinese. So there is an argument to be made that the best course of action for the United States is to wait, which I think is what the administration is doing. They're trying to see if the pressure works. I don't think it's going to, but the tools that are available to affect any other significant change on the position of the regime don't really exist. The only, I think, alternative is for the United States to make concessions on its own front, to suddenly say to Iran, like, oh, maybe you can enrich, or maybe we won't insist that you build missiles or something along those lines. But if I'm the United States, I see no reason to do that, right? The US has tremendous leverage. The US is in a stronger position vis-a-vis Iran than it was 6 months ago, given the effect of the war. The situation hasn't been resolved, but it's a lot less urgent and a lot less serious than it was before the war. So my expectation would be that the Trump administration is going to continue to sanction Iran, perhaps on the understanding that it's not going to change Iran's behavior, but that it's going to limit Iran's options, and that in time, it may result in meaningful space for diplomacy. If not in the short term, then perhaps somewhere down the road.
So just to conclude, in brief, what is your summary of sanctions, its effectiveness, Iran, and the oil network?
So I think we can think of oil sanctions as a permanent fixture in the global geopolitics of energy. As I mentioned, we have these two separate oil markets, the conventional oil market and the sanctioned oil market. And I think that's going to remain so long as the US maintains its position with Iran, so long as Iran maintains its position vis-a-vis the United States and Israel. The other countries that are involved in this sanctioned oil network, Venezuela, Russia, are also likely to remain under sanctions for an extended period of time, which means that the market is just going to have to get used to the fact that so much of the world's oil moves through this illicit channel. For Iran, it suggests an ability to continue to export oil in appreciable volumes. One thing that I didn't note, that I don't think I've noted, is that one of the reasons why sanctions are not effective is that if you go too far, if you sanction too much, if you're too aggressive, then that has real market implications because of the volume of the trade. One thing the Biden administration was very concerned about, and that I think the Trump administration is also concerned about, is that if you really try to stifle or shut off Iran, Russia, or Venezuela, you put upward pressure on oil prices, which put upward pressure on domestic gasoline prices in the United States. So there's a political and economic cost to going too far on sanctions. I don't think that's likely to change. So Iran has the outlook of, okay, we can sell a certain amount of oil. The US is going to continue to sanction us. The Chinese are going to keep taking the oil, but they might take a little less over the next couple of years, given how their own internal energy economy is changing. So the sanctions, they work to keep Iran in a box. They work to keep Iran under pressure. They're a permanent part of the global energy system now. They're not going to change the regime's position on the things that really matter, on the things that were the original basis of the sanctions all those years ago, the nuclear issue, regional proxies, ballistic missiles. I think it'll require a change in the leadership before it brings any change in the sanctions policy. That's my outlook.
Wow, that's fascinating. And just to close off, completely off topic, but how are your Farsi lessons coming along?
Well, I don't speak it quite as well as I used to because I've been doing a lot more on the oil than on the Iran side. I read a lot. I'm always, keeping up to date with my sources and with my Iranian media. So, that's as much as I can say on that front.
Well, thank you so much, Greg Brew. Thank you for joining us today on Eye for Iran.
Thank you so much.
Sign up for our weekly briefing newsletter at iranintl.com/newsletter. We deliver what you need to know with top stories, key analysis, and exclusive reports direct to your inbox. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, your go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, you can head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.